All right, according to my phone, since I'm of that generation that doesn't wear watches anymore, according to my phone, it is 20 after 10, and that's when they asked me to start, and I have till, I guess, about 11 o'clock. So if I go over this time, y'all just start beating the back of the pew or something like that. Say, it's time, let's go. No, again, it's good to be with you all this morning. And for our Bible class this morning, obviously it's a Bible class setting, so it's a little bit different than a minute ago. So I'm going to be thirsty for input in a lot of ways. But we're going to be talking this morning in our class about our relationship with people in the workplace. Of course, the title is Stuck at Work. It's hard to soar with eagles when you're working with turkeys. And of course, I don't want to use this class as name calling, but what I want to use this class time for is to talk about the challenges at times about being a child of God and being a Christian, being a faithful Christian. I might even might need to use that terminology when talking about our relationships in the workplace. The reason I say that is because I know and I understand that you work, especially in this area. We are at the top fringe of the Bible Belt. And so a majority of the people that you work with are probably going to say, yes, I'm a Christian. Or they hold to some form of belief of Christianity. But when you think about how many of those people live it, it might be a little bit different. And so I do want your input because of this. You're probably more qualified to teach this class than I am. The reason why I'm saying that is because, oftentimes people look at ministers, people look at preachers and say, well, we don't have a secular job and we don't have the ability to be in these environments every single day. And I'm going to agree with that. Now, it's not to say I've never had a secular job before. Growing up in high school and in college, I had plenty of them. Not to say that I got fired all the time, but I had secular jobs. I worked with people that were out in the world. And what we do in ministry, we're supposed to reach out to people of the world as well. That being said, again, I want your input because you all are in the trenches every day as far as going to a job where it is not required of you to be a Christian. And so sometimes it's very, very difficult for us to function, for us to live out our faith in those situations, in those environments. I want us to think about the fact that I want us to think about the difficulties of working in the world. And before I start putting stuff up on the screen, just share with me for just a moment. And I guess it's a big room, so just speak loudly if you can. But they don't have to be personal challenges. You can be somewhat generic. But if you want to share personal challenges or difficulties that you face working in the world, I want you to share those with me now. What are some of the most difficult things that you face? One of the biggest challenges that you face when it comes to your work and your faith? Nobody works here? Did I hear something? Yeah.
I'm a transplant. I retired out of Memphis.
Uh-huh.
So I grew around here. Been here about 4 years. Love everybody.
All right.
But when I was growing up, I'm 73 this summer, a few months. And I was a very shy person and middle child of 9 children.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't a problem. That I loved it, but it also meant that I was not the front person in anything. I didn't get the attention that my older brother did or my baby sister, and I liked it fine. I liked being in the shadows.
Uh-huh.
But I found myself tongue-tied when I tried to talk about Christ
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like I was such an outsider.
Uh-huh.
Because I was, in a sense, by the way I saw people act when I
Well, that's very, very honest, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think that more of us in this crowd would probably identify with this than what we like to admit sometimes, right? Whenever we feel like we're the only ones that believe a certain way, or that we're the only ones that really take our faith seriously, whenever we feel like, whenever we say something about Christ, you've got a whole slew of people that don't really care. You wonder how they're going to react to you. You wonder what they're going to say to you. And we get scared, quite honestly. We get scared about what's going to happen next. If I bring something up, or if I call somebody out for doing something that I really don't think is appropriate because of my faith, you know, what's going to be said to me, or what's going to be said about me? What is going to happen to my reputation here in the office, or here at the factory, or the warehouse, wherever we might work? What's going to happen to my reputation here? Because it's taken me a while to build my reputation up. I want to have a reputation of a good work ethic. I want people to be able to trust me in all that. But all that trust and stuff can go out the window if they don't respect me. And so we have fears and we have worries about that. Any other challenges or difficulties that you've noticed that maybe you might think is somewhat unique to your particular profession, your particular job?
Sometimes you experience some, I'm not going to say gossip, but talk that is maybe distasteful or uncolorful, but yet funny to most, and you're happen to be there, and so your reaction to it is very, as far as probably them noticing, well, he didn't laugh at that, or whatever it might be. So you get put in a lot of circumstances that are a little bit tough to handle.
And then even, discerning whether or not should I be listening to this. One of the best lessons, and I guess I'm giving a little plug here, one of the best lessons that I ever heard on this was a buddy of mine who preaches at a church here in Marshall County, I believe, but his name is Leo McKinney. He's a member at the Central Church in Paducah. And he's a teacher at Paducah Tillman, I believe. Teaches math stuff. But he talked at the youth rally there at Central in April. He was doing a class on gossip. And he was being very brutally honest about the temptation that he's fallen into it. A lot of times when he and other teachers would go into the break rooms, a lot of the conversations would start off with, "Did you hear this? Did you hear what so-and-so said? Did you hear what happened to so-and-so? Can you believe," or the sentence would start off with, "Can you believe so-and-so did this?" And a lot of times, even if he wouldn't give input to the conversation, what can very easily happen? What do our human ears like to do? We say, "Oh boy, I got to hear the meat on this." Our ears gravitate to that kind of stuff. And then we ultimately find out, and we ultimately know how damaging that can be to your fellow workers or to others. And when people associate you with, well, they were there in that conversation, and even if you didn't say anything, it's very difficult to be able to stay out of those things. But, not all of us work in a hostile work environment, but I'm sure that we all work in environments where sometimes hostile things happen, or where things that are inappropriate happen, things that we could get involved in that we shouldn't get involved in. And there are three temptations in a hostile environment or in a work environment, I would say, that we could succumb to. In Matthew 18, verses 7 through 9, is a passage that I want us to look at. Matthew 18, 7 through 9. It says, "Woe to the world for temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. Now, I know that obviously in the context of this and where Jesus here is talking about the temptation to sin, he's not limiting this by any means to the workplace. But he is letting us know that if we live and breathe on this earth, that we're going to face some challenges as Christians. That we're going to face some challenges as people that want to be followers of Christ. And of course, he gives that warning, woe to he whom through temptation comes. So hopefully, as Christians, we're not part of that. But he says that if you're the one that brings about these temptations, you're going to have some extra judgment upon you. And obviously, as Christians, we don't want to be put in that category, I would hope not, as being the one to be responsible for bringing about temptations on other people. If we're the ones that introduces the alcohol at a work party, think about that. If we're the ones that bring up these stories about a coworker, be judged for that. If we're the ones that begin conversations with a dirty or an inappropriate joke among our coworkers, if we're the ones that purposely wear attire in order to get the attention of our coworkers, or even to climb the ladder at work, and this can be men or women. I'm not picking on any particular gender. If we're the ones that throw someone else that we work with under the bus just so that we can climb up. These are all different temptations that we might have within the workplace. And we need to think about that. So there are temptations that we have in work environments. And oftentimes for a Christian, spiritually speaking, that can cause our work environment, that environment that we're in every day, to be somewhat hostile to our faith. Especially when we tell someone that does initiate these different things, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm not going to be a part of that. We might face some scrutiny for that, but we need to be careful with that. In James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, obviously we're told that we are going to be tested. We are going to be tested with various trials. And some of you face those tests every single day. And I know that can be extremely difficult. Something that I want to add to this, and we're getting to my favorite part of this lesson here in just a second. That is this. Whenever you work in the environments that you work in, some of you might be teachers. Again, some of you might work in a warehouse. Some of you might work in industry. Some of you might have a job where you travel in kind of the immediate area every single day. As a matter of fact, there's a gentleman that works for a hardware company in Huntingburg, Indiana, where I'm going. And he's down here in Benton and Paducah and Calvert City every single week. So he's down in this area oftentimes, interacting and working with people that are a little bit away from him and somewhat out of his element at times. But he comes and he sees those people every single day. But no matter what we do, whether we work in insurance or investments or anything like that, on one side of the coin or the other, whether it's the customers that you work with or the people that you work beside, you're going to be around some people that are dishonest. You're going to be around some people that take advantage of other people. You're going to be around those that do some really dumb things and some really wrong things for financial gain. You're going to be around people that do those type of things simply for popularity. I want to talk about this guy for just a second. You guys might recognize him from a couple of years ago. One of the, when big, huge, popular dignitaries pass away, usually their funerals are televised live on Fox News, CNN, all the other news outlets. And so the whole funeral is on there. Nelson Mandela's funeral made news big time. And it wasn't necessarily because of Nelson Mandela's death in and of itself. Now, it brought dignitaries from all around the world, and they filled an entire soccer stadium for this. If you can imagine just filling an entire football stadium here in America for somebody's funeral, it was a big deal. Dignitaries from all over the world, President Obama attended this funeral and spoke at it. But Thamsanqua Janji is the man that is standing right next to Barack Obama in this picture. Does anybody know why he was there? What was his purpose up on the stage? Okay, technically he was not supposed to be there. But whenever you have something big like this and it's going to be televised and stuff like that, you have to have an interpreter for the deaf. And oftentimes these countries will hire someone that is recommended by an association dealing with the International Sign Language Association or something like that. Now I'm getting the name wrong there, so forgive me for that. But they'll try to hire someone that is through that organization or has been certified through it or has been recommended by someone. Here you have good old Thamsanqua Janji. And you know what happened? He got up there, and for the 2.5 hours or so of this funeral, he got up there while these dignitaries were speaking, and he just waved his hands around. After about the first 15 or 20 minutes, those who were watching, at least at home, especially in the deaf community, caught wind of this. Well, they caught wind of it right off the bat. But they started complaining about it within about 15 minutes of the funeral. They were saying, this guy's faking it. There's nothing. This is all gibberish. Everything he's doing with his hands doesn't even mean anything. So what's going on here? And so all these complaints came in and everything. After the funeral was over, that word spread to the people that had put this funeral together and all that kind of stuff. And he was seen as this big, huge fake. I want you to think about, I don't know the figures of this, but how much would a guy get paid to do the sign language at a funeral this big? You would think it would be pretty big. I had heard that really it wasn't a whole lot of money, but he was doing this for the money nonetheless. He was doing it, he got a paycheck for doing this. But he wasn't honest about it. And as a matter of fact, he was saying that he was called to this job. He was called to this job to be dishonest about it. That's kind of the interesting thing here. I have a video, and we're going to try to make the sound work. If it doesn't work, I'll just try to narrate what he's saying. But it's confession time for Mr. Janji. Okay? So these news outlets, they decided, okay, we need to interview this guy to see what in the world was going on with him. Okay? And here are some of his claims. If I can get it going.
I don't know what to call it. I've seen angels coming to the stadium.
He saw angels come to the stadium.
Angels coming to the stadium. I start realizing that the problem is here. And the problem, I don't know the attack of this problem, how did it come? Sometimes I react violent on that place. Sometimes I will see like things like chasing me. And then, I was in a very, very, very difficult position.
The tree that towers above the rest is broken by the wind. Child of the wind.
Okay, apparently thank you is a salute, because that's what he did at the very end, right? Okay, so you guys got to see a little bit of what he was up there doing. I mean, just waving his hands around, and it didn't make a lick of sense. Now, those of us that don't have any background in deaf interpretation and stuff like that, I grew up at Washington Avenue in Evansville, and my whole entire life, they've had a deaf ministry there. So 5 or 6 deaf people sit in the audience, and then there's an interpreter standing up at a podium like this, interpreting the whole time. Now, I could sit there and not know what they're doing with their hands, not really understanding it, maybe picking up some of it over the years, but not having a clue. Most of the world had no clue what this guy was doing. But I want you to just think about, I understand he had an accent, and it was a very difficult accent to understand at times. But listen to what he was saying. He got up there and he completely faked it. And then he started making excuses for it. He said, well, I believe this was my calling to get up here and do this. But when I got up there on stage, all of a sudden I started seeing angels come into the stadium. And then he said there were these bad spirits that came in there, and I was trying to fight off the bad spirits. So apparently all this swinging around and stuff was fighting off these bad spirits. And he said, sometimes I get violent. Well, it turns out he's got some personality disorders. And he was, those are on his records, and he was still hired to do this job. But nonetheless, here is a job that he had that everybody was depending on him to do. They were depending on him to carry out this huge responsibility. And he didn't hold up to it at all. He didn't hold up to it at all. And so you think about how this happens maybe on a smaller level. Maybe it just happens on just a smaller level in your workplace, where maybe you hire someone that has all of these qualifications, yet when it comes down to the work, when the work begins, you realize that they're not qualified, they're not skilled in it whatsoever. Okay? Or maybe we volunteer, we claim that we have skills in a task just so we can get that job and just so we can get that extra money, yet we're getting it in the way of somebody else that could have actually done the work and done a really good job of it. You know, sometimes dishonesty in the workplace can be an extremely rampant thing, and it can be very devastating to the people you're around, to the people that you're affecting. But this guy, I mean, he's the penultimate of this kind of example. And I want you to think about just what has he done to his own credibility? Is he going to get a job interpreting for the deaf anywhere ever again? Okay, as far as I know, that has not happened because this ruined his reputation in that field. Now, he might have gone to school for it and might have actually had some of the skills needed to interpret, but he didn't use those skills in that instance. Again, he was just faking it. He was being dishonest in that situation. I want us to look at a dishonest coworker in the Bible. Now, I understand, with Judas had his purpose in the grand scheme of things, and then in the scheme of redemption with Jesus. And with Jesus going to die on the cross, Jesus knew that some of the things that Judas had done basically had to be done. But it took Judas making his own decisions to be dishonest to our Savior. John chapter 12 and verse 6. I just want to take a look at that real quickly. John chapter 12 and verse 6. Oops. I think I just exited. There we go. I exited out real quick. Let me read that real quick. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Okay, now I'm reading a passage right there in the middle of a story, but we already know that Judas went bad when it came to turning Jesus in. You know, he framed Jesus basically. He came to him and said, "Here is my Lord," and gave him a kiss on the cheek and identified him to the soldiers of the priest. And then Jesus was carried away to be sacrificed. But Judas was dishonest. Judas was not a very good co-worker before any of that ever happened. You see, Judas was put in charge of the money bags. And what brought about this conversation was that a woman came to Jesus and began to wash him, began to wash his feet, wash his hair, and she began to use this very, very expensive flask of perfume. Okay, something that would have been more than, well, I guess what I've read, it was about a month's wages worth. Can you imagine, ladies, can you imagine saving up for a bottle of perfume for an entire month? Can you imagine a bottle of perfume costing that much? Okay, that's what it was to this woman. Yet she pours it out on Jesus because she felt like he was worthy of it. And what did Judas think? He was like, "I can't believe that you're letting her waste that entire bottle of perfume. She could have sold that perfume and given that to our cause, to our ministry, to support us. But instead, she's just pouring it all over your feet. I can't believe this." And then Jesus is just like, "Leave her alone," he says in verse 7. "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." He says, don't make her give all that up. She can keep it for my burial later. She's preparing my body for that. And Jesus said all this knowing what Judas's real intentions were. Okay. Those of you that are bosses, you ever let things play out sometimes when you kind of know what's going on? You know you've got some workers that aren't being honest, or they're not being as productive as they're supposed to be, but they're telling you that they are. So you maybe you let things play out a little bit just to see how far they go. It'd be a sad state if we have Christians that have that reputation, right? Have that reputation in the workplace. You know, the reason why I bring all of this up is I want you to think about the damage that this causes. Okay, we've already said this about Judas and what had happened. He was taking money consistently from the apostles' treasury. Okay, so he wanted that bottle of perfume sold so that he could have a little bit more money in there so that he could spend that money on himself just a little bit. But here's the issue that we face, you all, in our culture, in our society. When somebody knows that you're a Christian, okay, when you've gladly said that, well, I'm a Christian, I attend the Benton Church of Christ, and you say that proudly, especially if you get into these theological conversations with our denominational friends. You want to proudly tell them what you're a part of, who you're associated with. Well, what happens when they know who you're associated with when it comes to your ethics, your morality, and you blatantly go against that morality, and you show that dishonesty in the workplace? What do people do? How do people associate you with religion? What do they automatically put all in the same category? Well, if that's how somebody's going to be from the churches of Christ, I don't want to have anything to do with that faith group. I don't want to have anything to do with them. He comes over here and he claims what the truth is and about worshiping in spirit and in truth and all this stuff. But look at how he's living. People associate that with how we act. So when the tables are turned here and we're talking about our responsibilities in the workplace, we can be like Tom Sakwa John Chi here. And we can have this reputation about us, or we can have this initial reputation where people believe we're going to do certain things, and then we can completely destroy that, and we can really throw the cause of Christ in the mud when we do that as well. And so we've got to do that. With the time left, I really want to share. We could go on and on. I could talk on and on and on. But I want us to think about our responsibility, just ending here. What is our responsibility in the workplace? What are the expectations that we should really have for ourselves when it comes to our faith in the workplace, sharing our faith in the workplace, and all that? Is your daily work, your daily job, is it your calling? You know, we often use that terminology, and of course, people use it with ministers all the time. I had a conversation with a denominational friend one time, and it was a time when I was just kind of discouraged, and I told him, yeah, I've thought about, from time to time, I've thought about stepping down from ministry and just looking at a different change of life, yet still being a faithful Christian. And he looked at me with the saddest and the most curious eyes, saying, well, how can you do that? How can you step down from ministry? Weren't you called to do that? Didn't God call you to be a full-time minister, and you're just going to ignore that calling? Okay? I think we need to be very, very careful about how we view God's calling in our lives. Okay? Some of us might say, well, you know, based on my skill set, God called me to be a doctor. Based on my skill set, God called me to help others with medical and health insurance. And that's something I never could get in because I'm horrible at math. I'm horrible at crunching numbers. All right? But you have somebody like Jared over here, he's got it figured out. At least he appears that way. I could say that. It's just not my calling or whatever. But I want us to think about what our calling is. Okay? Anyone can claim that they have been called to a certain job. But here's what we're called to. We are simply called, I believe, to please God. I think we're simply called to please God. This was Jesus' purpose in John chapter 8 and verse 29. Why was Jesus on this earth? You know, Jesus, his whole calling, basically, his whole mission was that he was going to sacrifice himself for the sins of the world. Now, he spent about 3 years in ministry trying to prepare people for that and trying to make them understand what was going to happen. But that was the calling. That was the overall mission. And that was for the spiritual aspect of things, the spiritual salvation of people. We think about, I'm doing my tapping here. Yeah, there we go. My scriptures are popping up. Okay? John 8 and 29. Also, Colossians 3 and verse 23. This passage says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord. Okay? Think about that. Now, that passage that Paul's given the Colossians here is not saying that you must hold to a certain particular job your whole entire life. You know, if that skill set is speaking to you, you do that or you're sinning. No, he says whatever you do, whatever it is that you do in your life, do it as if you're working for the Lord. Okay? That makes sense, doesn't it? Be honest in your workplace. Work hard. Get things done. Accomplish those things. Be a good example to your coworkers. That's what it's talking about. And then John 6 and verse 27. He says, here's the overall mission. Your calling as a Christian, your calling as a child of God is to work for the food that endures forever. And what is that? That's the spiritual relationship that you have with God. That is what is going to be of the most importance. And I want to close. There's some more content that I could talk about later on, but I want to close with a good friend of mine, and as a matter of fact, you may recognize him. I don't know if you would or not, but he spoke, I think, 4 or 5 years ago at the Summer Youth Series here at Benton, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? And at the time he spoke here, I believe he was the youth minister at the Rivergate Church of Christ. Brian is no longer a youth minister. It's not because he did anything bad or immoral and he got booted out in that way. He got burnout. He just had some struggles in that realm and didn't think that he was growing as a Christian as he wanted to. So he got out of youth minister and he became a Nashville Metropolitan Police officer. And I got to tell you, he is one of my best friends in this world. Absolutely awesome. But I want you to think about this question, or think about this thought here. He went from youth ministry to law enforcement. Was he called out of youth ministry? You know, God had him in the spot of being a full-time minister, ministering to young people. And then God said, okay, you quit that and you go be a police officer. Okay? We can't necessarily, that was a direct calling from God. But that is where Brian himself felt like he needed to make a change, even for his own spirituality, which is interesting. He chose the career that he did. But Brian, from what I understand, does the job to the best of his ability, and he pleases the Lord. As a matter of fact, he spoke at Evangelism University in Savannah, Tennessee, this past January. He's not a full-time minister, but he was one of the keynote speakers, as a matter of fact, on Sunday morning. And when he got up there in front of all those teenagers, he said, never think that you have to be in full-time ministry to reach people. He said ashamedly, really, he said, I've reached more people for the gospel of Christ as a Metro police officer than I ever did as a full-time youth minister. And why is that? It's because every single day he's dealing with people that are caught up in this sinful world. He's dealing with people that are having these traumatic situations in their life. And you know what? You think, oh, well, he works for a government agency and all that. He works for that local government agency. He's not allowed to talk a lot. Well, let me tell you this. Nothing stopped him yet. One of the first things that he ever did was he had to go to this house where a baby had virtually died in the crib. And he had to resuscitate this baby. He had to work on it. Didn't happen. But he escorted the family to the hospital. They got the baby in there and they began to work on that baby. And the only thing that he could do from that point forward after working on that baby was, he said, can I pray with you guys? As a police officer, can I pray with you all? Would you all mind that? And they said, absolutely. And he made a pretty big impact on that family just by showing, I'm not just a police officer here to be paid, but I'm working for the Lord too. And that's a part of my job. As a matter of fact, it created kind of a comical scene in the hospital there itself, because Brian gets done with his prayer, and then in walks the hospital chaplain, and he says, hey, can I pray with y'all? And they said, no thanks, this police officer already did. You know, he already did that for us, and they were so appreciative of it. But again, here's a guy that's gone into this work of being a police officer. He hasn't forgot the Lord. He hasn't forgot what his true calling is, and that is to serve God in whatever capacity. When we answer the call of Christ, we basically say, Lord, I want to be a child of yours, and I want to work hard for you every single day. And that's it. That is the calling. And that's what is important. I would have gone on just to talk about, and I'll just put this heading up there. You know, sometimes we don't like our jobs. But we can love what we do even when we hate our jobs. Because I'm going to tell you this, anytime you go to work, you're going to be around lost souls. You're going to have the opportunity that even if you're not in the best and most desirable of environments, even if you don't like what you're doing, yet you're enduring through it and you're working because you know it's the right thing to do, you're providing for your family, and you're working as if to the Lord, then you're being that light, as we talked about in the sermon earlier. You're being that light to your coworkers. You're being that light to the community. And that is our calling, folks. Even if we're eagles trying to soar, working with turkeys, our calling is to be an influence for Christ. And I'll say this, just real quick. If our profession, if our job, if our work is dragging us down spiritually, if the temptations that are in your workplace are in a point where you can't bear them, think about the passage that we read a while ago about if anything causes you to stumble, what do you do with it? You cast it away. Sometimes we need to change our jobs. Sometimes we need to find a new place to work. We don't always like to do that because we're like, well, I'm just scared about supporting my family. First and foremost, though, you need to worry about the spiritual well-being of yourself and your family. That is your calling as a Christian. Thank you all very much for being with me this morning, or letting me be with you, I guess I should say. I've enjoyed being with you all. And invite me down anytime you can. I'd love to come be with you guys. I'm only 2.5 hours away.